Good evening, everybody. It's very nice to have you all with us, if virtually. I'm Charlotte Ransom, and I'm the Chief Executive of Netwealth. I know that some of you know Netwealth quite well, others of you less so. So just to give you a very brief bit of background, it's a company that I co-founded 5.5 years ago now. And we really launched it on the basis that we felt that wealth management in its traditional form had lots of things to offer, but had not yet really taken advantage of any type of modern technology. And so we very deliberately have tried to combine those two things, and largely down to the fact we feel that modern technology is a way to get people closer to their money, have a better sense for how their investments are behaving, how much they may be paying to have their money invested and so on, and at the same time to be able to reduce costs. So that what we've discovered over the last 5.5 years since launch is that we've been able to work with people who may have already been consuming some type of wealth management service or may have been managing their assets themselves, and that they've been able to find a place at Netwealth where they're able still to have a high degree of transparency, control over their investments, but at the same time feel as though they're paying the right price for it, which is considerably lower than a more traditional service, and that they always still have access to humans. And I guess that's something that we will be talking a bit about today, that human interaction and the way humans communicate is absolutely critical when it comes to the discussion of this evening, which is understanding your family's approach to wealth and introducing this concept of financial tribes. And I'm delighted to be joined by Claire Barrett this evening. She may well be very familiar to a lot of you since she's the consumer editor of the FT. She writes the weekly Serious Money column and also presents the fantastic Money Clinic podcast, which if you haven't heard, I recommend that you try. Claire also frequently appears as a commentator on radio and TV, and is a regular guest on Eddie Mair's Drive show on LBC Radio. So Claire, welcome this evening.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a great thing to be talking about.
I know it's a topic that you and I both are very motivated by and enjoy talking about. What viewers may well have noticed is that there are only two of us. We were going originally to have Emma Maslin, who is otherwise known as the Money Whisperer, and very sadly, unfortunately, one of her children went to a soft play entertainment thing this weekend, picked up a bug that she now has. So we understand it's not COVID, but nevertheless, she didn't want to risk infecting all of us this evening.
Mercifully.
Yeah.
But get well soon, Emma, if you're watching.
Exactly. So when we were thinking about this evening, maybe I should also say that Netwealth has historically had an annual event for female investors. And this is the replacement for that this year. It's virtual. Typically, it would be physical. I know that we don't only have female callers in this evening, but some of the things that we will be discussing are the different approaches to wealth that women have versus men, and also perhaps how communication works within families and the differences there as well. But I think it felt like a good time to discuss different approaches to wealth, and particularly because we've all lived through really a very difficult period. No one has come out of the pandemic unscathed. One of the things which I feel has been true for me, and I know is true for lots and lots of people, including lots of our clients, is that personal finance is often something which is just way down people's to-do lists. And that's because it's a topic that often is difficult for people to engage with, and there's a level of discomfort. And there's always something better to do than think about money. And I think one of the things that happened during the pandemic is that we were forced suddenly to think about how much have we put aside. Are we able to withstand, for example, being laid off or children being laid off? Have we got the ability to help children, relatives, siblings, and so on? So I think there's been a sort of conscious re-engagement with finance that has come about because of the pandemic. And then there's been obviously questions around mortality and, our own mortality, or those of our parents, of younger people. We read and heard about it, all of us, every day, obviously, as the sort of pandemic moved along. And things that go with being ill too, the potential for long-term care costs, for example, and again, sort of thinking about the financial setup that we have within our families. And I think it's really only when crises like these hit that it suddenly crystallizes a lot of these things in our minds. And the other thing that we've all done, and lots of people, and I should mention that both Claire and I have young adult children and stepchildren. We have siblings, we have parents, and we're going to cover all of these different sort of generational aspects in the conversation today. But one thing we did do was lock down, many of us, with our young adult children. And suddenly we were living together under one roof again. And something that I experienced, and I think lots of our clients experience, is one, obviously the joy of having everyone together again, but also getting a sense for these young adults as they moved into an environment where they've become more independent and are no longer relying on their parents, that you start to see different aspects of their personalities and get a sense for some of the things that do concern them, or some of the things they hadn't maybe talked about. And the financial aspects to that are some of the things that we'll want to cover.
Absolutely.
But I think maybe just to kick things off then, thinking about what did we discover during this period of very difficult markets and a difficult environment. It would be really interesting, Claire, if you could just talk a bit about, there you are with the sort of the FT inbox and a huge number of people who are interacting with you on a regular basis. It would be very interesting just to hear sort of your take on what people wanted to talk about and what was top of mind for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should start off by saying, I feel in a hugely privileged position to be somebody who is approached by readers and told their innermost thoughts. Often it's almost a bit like a counsellor. If it's somebody that you don't know, it's easier to communicate these feelings. So I hope that some of that knowledge and experience can help people who are on the call today, because we're all struggling really with the same problems, and communication is at the heart of it, but also impetus. Now, you said personal finance, even us as, so-called experts. I did an Instagram post at the weekend saying, here's a list of all of the things that I've done today in order to avoid doing my accounts, which ranged from deep cleaning the kitchen to, sorting out a cupboard. Because let's face it, you've got to be in the right mindset for doing personal finance stuff. It's not easy. You've got to make decisions. You've got to decipher jargon. You've got to be in a position, I have to say, I have done my accounts now, but you have to be in a position where you feel that you can do it. And for some of us that involves, decluttering of other areas to focus on the task in hand. And for many people it involves having quite difficult conversations. Now, what the pandemic did in the early days from my interactions with readers is it made all of us, regardless of our age, incredibly aware of our own mortality. And that's interesting from a personal finance point of view for many reasons. Now, early reaction from readers was, need to update the will. Oh dear, I can't because solicitors are all outside their offices. Now, we managed to get a change in the law eventually, so that you no longer need to have witnessed. You can have digitally witnessed documents. Now, whether that will be a permanent change, I think personally it should be. But then flowing from the will, you've also got the decision of, well, who do we give money to in the will? Now, we're going to talk about that a bit later because that was something that your research really picks up across. And when do we communicate this kind of information? Then, do we have adequate life insurance if one of us dies? Now, I'm the main breadwinner in my family, and I thought, well, if I do get this virus and die, what's going to happen? Because I am the chief financial sorter-outer, how will my husband know what to do if I am no longer here? Now, in other relationships, it could be the other way around. We might have people watching, who are the other side of that equation and don't know how to ask their partner to give them more of an in on what's going on with the finances. But it did make me think about insurance. I decided I was underinsured. I've taken out critical illness cover. I've lost about 2 stone in weight because I was obese. I'm on the borderline now, which is a good thing.
Great.
But this is, your health is your wealth, right?
Yes.
And the fact that being overweight made me more likely to die of COVID, plus having more time to go and run around the park and think about menus, that all helped. And I consider that to be as much of a financial decision as taking out the insurance, but also thinking about how much of a buffer we have in case something goes wrong. And really, the pandemic coming along was, hundreds and hundreds of rainy days all at once. Now, in those first few weeks when we had the shutdown, being sent home, working from home, the sort of chaos of all of that happening, I don't think I got any sleep really at all, partly because I've never been worked so hard in my life, because it was the biggest financial story that had happened in my career, but also when I wasn't writing for the FT or talking about things with Eddie on LBC, I was thinking, oh gosh, where does this leave us? What happens if, my husband or one of our kids, who are all in the early stages of their different professional careers, loses their job and needs help from us? What will happen if one of my parents dies? How on earth are they going to get groceries if they're shielding? All of these kind of questions all of a sudden were sort of thrown into the air. But then we did have the benefit of lockdown, and not being able to go and spend money or socialise meant that we did have to, have the chance to really focus on some of these financial questions. And I think that there'll be people watching tonight who are kind of like further along in that journey, and it has sparked conversations and change. And there'll be some people who maybe feel like they've got a bit more to go. Maybe their family is feeling a bit more disconnected as a result of lockdown, because they weren't all thrown together. And frankly, we can take questions on either. But I think the worry of thinking, will we have enough? Do I have enough of a cash position? Is now possibly changing a bit from some people, and thinking, well, things hopefully are back on the right path. Have I been too cautious?
I mean, you brought up this notion of communication, which I think is something actually that we're going to talk quite a lot about tonight. But actually you were bringing up in the context of partners, husbands and wives, or partners. And I wonder whether that is something which you found has changed, or if you're asked a lot about more than you would have been. Because I think it's exactly as you said, typically you will have within a partnership somebody who is more likely to be the bigger earner. And there's a question over how much transparency is there across the partnership in terms of what the family wealth is. So when we talk about communication as we go on this evening, and we start talking about other generations, it sort of starts with, the people at the top, not necessarily at the grandparent level, but I'm talking now at the parent level.
Yeah.
And is that something that you see come up quite often in terms of people's, questions of what do I need to know? What do I need to ask? What are the types of things that I might be missing out on? Because it sort of leads on to something else you mentioned, which is that personal finance can be quite complicated. Now, I'm strongly of the view that it is and absolutely should be less complicated than people think. And I think there are ways to make it less complicated. And that's one of the things that we've, tried very hard to do in terms of when people work with Netwealth. But I think quite often there's a separation in people's minds about all of the, for example, everything they read about pensions and the changes and the regulation and what has changed and what might change. It's a blur to most people. And I think if you're in a partnership where the blur happens to be the person you're married to, that's a worrying place to be if you aren't in a position to be able to sort of clarify between you what the family's finances look like.
And I've got lots of friends, as well as colleagues and readers of the FT, who have said to their partners, okay, I'm not the dominant one in terms of sorting out all of the money, but like, hey, if one of us dies, I need to know this stuff. I mean, I've set up, very simple, an asset register. Sounds complicated. It just basically means if I die of COVID or get squashed by a bus on my way home on my bicycle, as nearly happened a few days ago, I've invested in a better reflective outfit, then my husband will not only kind of like have a better overview of our finances and where things are, but will know, how to go forward. I mean, digital password sharing devices, they've really taken off under lockdown, which is very interesting. I think that when it comes to that, relationship and how you can, as a couple, better understand what's going on. One of our columnists at the FT, Ken Okororifor, who runs a website and a YouTube channel called The Humble Penny, he is one of many different financial podcasters and commentators who I asked last New Year's Eve, what should your financial resolution be? Because lots of people are inspired to use the pandemic experience to carry forward into the new year and look at their finances. And his answer was, have a money day every month with your partner. And I thought, okay, this is a really good idea. Basically, you sit down at the beginning of every month and say, well, here we are. This is our cash position. This is what we've got in our investments. It's gone up by this much or gone down. Here is what our pensions are looking like. And also to spend some time talking about goals. And I found that it was the talking about goals bit that me and my partner had never really found time for. And that could be connected with jobs, with careers, with retirement. Is one of you going to retire first? Can you afford to? Could you afford as a couple for one to retrain? During the early stages of the pandemic, he was furloughed because he was shielding. And I thought, well, should he be in a different job? He has actually modified his job somewhat as a result of us thinking about this. But other couples, they might think, well, I've got 10 years at least worth of work in me. I'd quite like to change career, or I've always wanted to do this or do that, or as we're seeing with what they're calling the Great Resignation nowadays. You know what? I really hate my job. I don't want to go back to the office. Have I got enough to actually take a step back and retire? Or it could be something like helping out the children, or in our case, could we afford to move to a different property? We've always lived in a flat. Is this now the time to think about? I'm trying to think of the tabloid phrase, the race for space. We were stuck in there under lockdown. Fortunately, we've got access to some outdoor space, and we live near 2 very large London parks. But we really thought, well, actually, is this the time to think about buying a house with a garden? So it could be any of those things. And frankly, the amount of times that we managed to have a money day every month, I could count on the fingers of one hand. But we did do it a couple of times, and even just that as an exercise was a way of starting a conversation, which is a very much ongoing thing.
Yes,
so this is the other big point I'd make, is that you're not going to sort all of these things out in one conversation.
No.
But if you've got an ongoing process as a couple, then that can help feed into, could we afford to give our children some money now, or how do we start this money day type conversation with them?
So it's a whole new type of date night.
Yeah. You could do it in a restaurant
now.
you
could do it in a restaurant. I think your point about the thing that actually resonated with you two as a couple were goals. And I could not agree more about that, because I think for a lot of people, this notion of money and wealth is very abstract. And the more abstract it is, the harder it is then to relate it to actually you as an individual or you as a couple or you as a family. And it's one of the things that we find makes such a difference is when you can, as you say, talk about what actually am I trying to do with this money I've got. And, typically people will have longer term goals, which will be, okay, I'm thinking about retirement in 15 years' time, and then of course my retirement will be hopefully another 25, 30 years. So very long term, but maybe shorter term I'm thinking about educating the children. Do we send them all to private school, for example?
Yeah.
Or,
the grandchildren?
Or grandchildren. Or if there is mortgage still to pay, do we pay off the mortgage or do we invest? So I think this concept of goals is very important, and interestingly, certainly my experience at Netwealth is that it is particularly relevant for a female investing community.
Oh yes.
And it's very interesting, because I think your traditional sort of way of approaching wealth management was much more transactional, and that's had a bigger male audience, for all the reasons we understand historically, and actually that was very alienating for the female audience. And now what I'm finding is it's equally good, male or female, to be able to think about our wealth in the context of these different goals. And it's one of the reasons why I think, half our clients are women, because it's sort of representative of society, and you can start to line things up in a way that makes sense for you, and I think links into other aspects of your life. So maybe sort of leading on from that, we know that money night or date night or whatever it is going to work for some people and less so for others. And there will always be people in families who are, less financially inclined than others. And it could be among siblings, it could be, siblings at our level, it could be among our children and stepchildren. And I think you've had experience of this, and I have as well, which is where, and it goes back again to communication, which is where, within a family unit in its broadest sense, people typically want to support each other. But because money is less talked about than some other things, sometimes it's something which is left sort of too much to one side, when in fact it's something that should be brought into the fore and talked about. So, it's very likely within a family, for example, you have, in our case, there were two people who went into the city, then there was one who went into cooking and another that went into PR. So very, very different experiences, very different type of pay packets. And actually it took a conversation in my case with my parents to say, okay, we're all different, we all have different competencies, but I want you to know that in my case, I would like you to feel completely free, in case you're not, to just work with whichever siblings you feel are going to benefit most from help. And I think you had a similar sort of interaction in your family that you'd lived through.
Yeah, both ways, kind of upwards to my parents and then downwards to my stepchildren. I think that one of the things that the pandemic has taught me about money is that truly the biggest luxury we have is time. And often if you're working all the time, like I am, you think, yes, this is great, accumulation. But it's that luxury of having the time to spend with the people who you love and value the most that can often be the sacrifice as a result. And I think a lot of women especially who've leaned in during the pandemic, particularly if they are the higher earner, and kept going, often to the detriment of family life, because they've thought, got to hang on to the to the big pay packet. Have had a real reevaluation of what they're actually working for, and also the cost of childcare. Now, I don't have little children, but my brother does. He has three very adorable little children who are at the moment all under the age of 6. And certainly before the pandemic, it was much easier for the childcare arrangements to work financially, because either my parents or my sister-in-law's parents or me would cover the Friday of the week, so that they only had to have a nanny share for a certain number of days. And of course that was all blown up by the pandemic. So I felt very strongly that I wanted to help, and the best way that I could help was not to give my money to pay for childcare, but the best way was for me to give my time, and take Fridays off from the FT, who very graciously let me work flexibly, so that I could go and help them out. And I saw that as an investment in my auntyhood, right, if you like, because I'm a lot closer. I was always close to them, but I'm definitely a lot closer to them now as a result of having not just been there for the nice bits of life, like the birthday parties and the high teas, or and the outings, but been there for the meltdowns, the potties being tipped over, and and all of the rest of it. And for me, that is absolutely part of family life. But I also have had conversations with my parents and said, well, I know that you want to treat us both equally, because we did argue terribly when we were younger, and I won't be at all offended if you would like to give some more money to my brother. You don't feel that you have got to give the same to me if money is needed now. This was at the early stage of the pandemic where we didn't really know how things were going to pan out, and they were quite relieved, to hear that. So I definitely think it is a two-way conversation. And then looking down at my stepchildren, the eldest one, who's 28 nearly, she got married this summer. They got engaged under the pandemic, and it was very important to us to help them A with the wedding, but B with buying their first house together. So we were nowhere near the average bank of mum and dad donation, because her partner's a bit older than her. He already had a property, so he had money to bring in. But I felt very strongly that we wanted to give her something, and I also gave her the choice. And I said, would you rather have more money towards the property, right answer, or or more money towards the wedding? Because obviously we will help you with both, but there's going to be a limit to to the split. And we have made it very clear to the other two children who aren't yet married or on the property ladder, that similar help will be forthcoming, because I felt very strongly I don't want them to think that there's favouritism, that we've given her the money because she was the first to get married and now there is no more. And equally, I want them to know that they're equally loved. Yeah.
So this is all open and transparent. And So I think, that is the sort of absolute critical aspect to this, that parents, of course, can do whatever they want to do, but there should be a level of transparency around what they're doing and why they're doing it. And I think maybe they would be surprised by the level of buy-in they might get from other people, even if it's not necessarily, that the whole thing is split 50-50. And I think it brings up a question actually that we've got, which is, when is the right time to start passing on money to young adult children? And what we say we're asked this quite a lot is the first thing to do is to get yourself sorted out.
Yeah. So put your own oxygen mask on first.
Exactly. And so it's really a question of being in a position to know that you've got enough to retire on, that you've got the the safety net of potentially you might decide when you first retire you're going to go travelling, then you may quieten down a bit, and then there may be extra costs to factor in, towards the later end of life. So it's very important that people have the level of transparency they need for their own needs. But I think that after that, giving while living is actually the right way to go about things. And I think historically there has been a sort of tendency to put everything in a will, and, once I die, it's not my problem anyway. Everyone can kind of, work with it, whatever the thinking was. But of course, the implication of that with people living longer is that sometimes wealth doesn't get cascaded until their children are in their 50s or 60s. And actually, that's not when people need the money.
Certainly not now.
Certainly not now. So you're quite right. I mean, the big difference now for our young adult children is there is no defined benefit pension.
No.
There are incredibly expensive properties. There is a very competitive labour market, which depending on where you sit, you may be the beneficiary of, or you may find actually, it's tough to earn the salary that you want. So there's all sorts of reasons why our children are likely to benefit enormously from us going at this earlier than our parents might have done. And I think the other thing which I like is that you can also then enjoy your children enjoying it. So, you decided, it sounded like that was the decision that you made for the wedding and then for the home. But is that something which, comes up again with your readers in terms of sort of when is the right time to give, and what sort of advice do you give them on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the single most troublesome issue for FT readers, and probably of many other papers as well, is inheritance tax. If you are in a certain bracket of wealth where you're not kind of like super, super rich, but nevertheless you've done quite well and your family home is, probably worth £1 million or so, then you are in the enviable and lucky position of potentially being caught by inheritance tax. So, I mean, a lot of our readers got married because they had been living together for decades and had suddenly realised that there would be an enormous inheritance tax liability if that didn't happen. So that was another kind of direct response of the pandemic. But a lot of them also started thinking about tax planning. Now, it's important to note that you don't necessarily need to go and see a financial advisor in order to benefit from financial planning. They're quite distinct and separate jobs, and I know that financial planners in particular have never been busier. There's actually a shortage of para-planners in the UK at the moment, which is really to tie into your comments about the labour market. So inheritance tax is something that worries them. We were very worried that there might be changes to the rules at the last budget. Very worried about wealth taxes at the beginning of the pandemic. But the government seems to have really sent out quite a firm message that, you know, despite its kind of impersonation of the Labour Party, shall we say, in many other areas of policy, it is very much sticking to the idea that taxing the wealthy is not something, you know, that's not a Rubicon at the moment that it wishes to cross.
I think one thing actually also to mention on taxes, because of course it's something we're asked a lot about as well, is that it's extremely unusual if there's a tax change that it's introduced overnight. So that it comes back to this concept of planning. So in the event there is a change, typically it's, well, as of next tax year or something like that, so that you have 6 months or maybe longer to plan for whatever changes are about to happen. And I think that sort of, again, leads back to, if you're reasonably on top of your finances, then as taxes potentially change, you know, you have a chance to kind of engage, change anything if that needs changing, and then to move on. So I think perhaps it might be useful to introduce this idea that we have talked about in the title of this evening, which is this notion of financial tribes. So there's a piece here, which I don't know whether it's to camera or not, but I hope it is, which, while Claire quietly chokes next to me, which we called the Generation Game Financial Tribes in Family Finance. And what we did is we spoke to 2,000 people, so 1,000 lot of parents and 1,000 children between ages 25 to 35. And we were really trying to get into this notion of the psychology of money. And what I'm going to do actually is there's something I would like to read out to the listeners, just some key statistics, because it's quite startling when I imagine many of us feel as though we have quite an, you know, open relationships with our children and within families, but potentially we're communicating things in ways not as well as we think. And a couple of different statistics. So only 53% of parents, by the way, plan on splitting their wealth evenly among their children when they pass away. So that's an interesting statistics, because
that's
I think
a recipe for a family row at Christmas.
Well, so potentially yes, unless there's a communication about, okay, well, what I mean by that is I'm giving, you know, I've given maybe 1 or 2 children a certain amount leading up to this, and therefore it's the one that hasn't had anything or hasn't had as much who will be getting more in the will. Another is that fewer than a quarter of young adults, 23%, have had open discussions with their parents about their respective plans for the future. Now, that is a very low number.
Incredibly low. And when you think it's not just about financial support, you know, it's about emotional support as well. And nobody knows me better than, you know, my mum, my dad, my partner, my brother, my stepchildren. And you want to get the benefit of the conversation both ways.
Yes.
You know, I mean, it's talking about career plans and talking about, you know, whether you're going to have a baby or not. And, you know, all of these things obviously have got a financial knock-on consequence, but it's, you know, the emotional consequences can be just as big.
Absolutely. Interestingly, 3/4 of parents, 76%, believe their child is in control of their finances, whereas only half of young adults would agree that they are. So there's a sort of another disconnect going on there. And then moving into this notion of a tribe, and I'm going to talk in a moment about the different financial tribes there are, but the one that most people identify with is this notion of being a self-sufficient saver. And there we found actually that 1/3 of young adults would classify themselves as that, and actually almost half of all parents. But what we can see just from those stats is that there is this sense that adults aren't communicating with their children. The reason I think probably 3/4 of adults think their children are in control of their finances is because as adults, we know what our plan is for them, but they don't know what our plan is for them. And therefore there's this complete disconnect between whether they're in control or not, or whether they feel confident about their finances or not. And when we talk about tribes, it's probably worth just outlining a little bit in more detail sort of what we mean by that, because I think I would say that more or less we all are a tribe member, and maybe we're a member of more than one tribe. But the self-sufficient saver is a really interesting one, because this is where saving is about feeling in control, being safe and secure. And, you know, we're organised, we're responsible with money, we like to live within a budget. That all sounds good. Tick, tick, tick. Might delay gratification, we'll save up over time for a big purchase. But where the but comes in is a self-sufficient saver also tends to be overcautious. And so they are always anxious about not having enough. And therefore, going back to this idea you brought up very early on about having a safety net and enough cash and so on, there is very often a reluctance to invest as much as they should. And therefore, they don't build up the pot that they could, because there's this sense always that, okay, I'm in control and I've got it all sorted, but it's right here and I'm not going to risk it in the markets. And what I also think is interesting is that if we know that that's the majority of parents who put themselves in that bucket and the majority of children, and we also know that children learn financial habits from their parents.
They do.
That it sort of explains why, and this is a statistic that I'm always fascinated by, if you take the national statistics on ISAs, which is well over 600 billion in the UK, 600 billion pounds invested in ISAs, over half of that is sitting in cash.
Yeah, extraordinary.
And yet the holding period for ISAs is over 5 years. So that is worrying. And it comes down to this characteristic that we've classified as a self-sufficient saver, where people are doing the right thing by, you know, saving their money, thinking about what the different needs might be, but they're not necessarily taking that extra step of investing. And there maybe it goes back perhaps to this question around finance being overly complex and overly sort of alienating, and this idea that I might lose money and that's a scary thing. So how do you, you know, talk to people who come to you and ask you that question about what they should be doing?
Well, it's a question we get asked a lot, especially on Money Clinic podcast, which is aimed at a slightly younger audience, kind of 25 to 35, so sort of like at the beginning of their wealth journey.
So for the younger group in this survey.
Yeah,
actually.
and the biggest problem that they have with investing is exactly the self-same problem that I had myself when I was lucky enough to fit into that age category, which is namely, well, markets are at all-time highs. You know, markets have been at all-time highs pretty much for the last 15 years, and when you are somebody who doesn't have a lot of money and you think, well, I can afford maybe to save, you know, £200 or £300 a month from my budget, well, I would say the first thing, automate, make sure it comes out on payday, so that you don't get used to spending it. But then if you are going to invest it, you've then got the barrier of what do I choose? I mean, index funds and, you know, wealth platforms that are very automated have kind of removed a lot of that burden for the entry level investor. But during lockdown, because people have had more time, we've also seen an enormous rise in the use of things like trading platforms and also putting money in cryptocurrencies, much riskier behaviour, because, you know, extra money from not having to pay to travel to work has kind of coincided with extra time and, dare I say it, a bit of boredom. So having a bit of a gamble on the markets has been a great distraction for some of our listeners. We did an episode a while ago about somebody who at the age of 19 had kind of unwittingly found himself getting sucked into day trading. And he came to us and said, I can see that, you know, the amount of money I'm making or managing not to lose is fairly minimal. But he was like staying online for sort of like 6 or 7 hours at a time and, you know, watching share price movements in GameStop and, you know, other US stocks that the kind of internet community had alighted on. And when you actually looked at the amount of time he was investing in this versus the amount of money he was getting back, he could see he was an intelligent lad, that it wasn't really worth his while, but it had provided him with entertainment almost during lockdown. So Merrin Somerset Webb, our columnist, was one of the experts on that show and said, well, this has been a great kind of opener, if you like, to what investing can be like, albeit imperfect. But we've got to start thinking about the longer term. And that would be my advice for anybody younger today who's thinking, well, yes, again, markets are looking very toppy. Why should I start to invest now? I've always favoured the regular monthly savings approach, so much so I said at an event once about 6 years ago, which again was for women, although they edited it out of the video. I said I think it would be really great if Tampax and Bodyform could have a leaflet inside period products for women saying, got your period, time to think about investing, a regular monthly investment is the way to go. Because if you're 30 now, what the stock markets do while your money is in there, growing hopefully over time, getting the benefits of dividends and getting the benefits of compound interest, if you were starting today and putting an enormous lump sum in, and then next year we get an almighty market crash, then of course, that's going to be a big disincentive to save more. And certainly, in the dot-com boom, many people were put off.
Yeah, so it's an averaging in mechanism.
Yeah, exactly, really. The pound cost averaging.
Yeah.
And so I feel very comfortable about, pushing a certain amount of my salary into my pension every month, getting the benefit of the employer top-ups, which is another great lesson for young people to learn, and putting a certain amount into my ISA. I've already made the fund decisions, so I don't need to physically do anything every month. It's all done for me. And then every sort of quarter or so I'll have a look at what's in there, and often I think, blimey, that's quite good. And then I remember, well, actually, because I haven't got used to spending that money, once you see how it can start to build up, obviously we've had a very good run on markets since that pandemic nadir in March 2020, but not needing the money to spend gave me the confidence during the pandemic to leave it in that ISA or in that pension to grow. Because I do say to myself, when I put money in the ISA, I don't want to I don't want to be taking that money out until I'm after the age of 60. I very much see it as a long-term savings vehicle. Again, coming back to goals and what we're actually saving for, and very much the ISA and the pension are both later in life, long-term, and then I've got other savings products that are more short-term and less risky for things that we want to do in the next 3 to 4 years.
Yeah. It's interesting you were mentioning the sort of crypto and things like that, because one of the things we talk about at Netwealth is the 3-pot theory. And I sort of think we all live and die, broadly speaking, by 3 pots, even if we don't realise it, which is that we have the sort of liquid pot 1, and that is your income, and it may be dividends or rental income if you have a buy-to-let portfolio, for example. And that's your sort of current account. And then there's the pot 3, which is the illiquid or the volatile pot. And sometimes I call it the passion pot, because actually that's the bit where, for people who are reluctant to invest, that's the bit they enjoy. So in Britain, for example, it's your home. That's a big investment. You may have the buy-to-let portfolio I mentioned, so you may have some other property in there. But it may also be something that is fun and that interests you. So cryptocurrency being an example. Or, I sort of kicked myself for the fact that at the beginning of the pandemic, why didn't I go and buy a Ocado stock, right? Because, I, like everyone else, was trying to get an Ocado slot and couldn't. So I thought I should have gone and bought the stock. So where Netwealth fits in is what we call pot 2, which is the sleep well money. And this is where you want to have your money in a place that's low cost, liquid and transparent. And I'm sort of thinking now about these self-sufficient savers, because if you can get the core of your money in a place where you are earning the market, you are earning an inflation plus type of return, you'll experience some level of volatility, but hopefully that's lined up with the goals you're trying to achieve. And so you can think about risk and return in relation to those goals. Then I think you can start to be much more efficient across these pots and have less in the cash pot, which we know people have too much. They may have done the right thing by getting the ISA wrapper, did the wrong thing by not investing it. And I think that is something which hopefully will become a really useful way to try to get people more engaged, and at the meantime not having to do it themselves, because lots of people don't want to manage their money themselves, as we know. Some do, some don't. So the dominant tribe is the self-sufficient saver, but we also have, for example, the head in the sand avoider.
Oh, yes.
And I know I suppose I probably wouldn't have called myself that exactly, but I do know that when I was a banker for 2 decades, and I was working like crazy, and I knew I was being paid enough to cover my sort of main things, I did avoid engaging with finance.
You and loads of other finance professionals,
yes,
because it's the day job.
It's the day job.
It's the day job.
But I think what worries me a bit, certainly in the context of women in general, is that there was actually a really interesting survey done by the regulator in June last year, and it was called Financial Lives, and they were trying to look at how have people been affected and what type of engagement are people having with their money. And actually they picked out the fact that women in particular tend to be more financially vulnerable, and that part of this again is this relationship women have with money. And they had an interesting example of take pensions and we know for many people their pension is an incredibly important part of their overall wealth, and we also know that it's very long term, and that it's good if it's long term, but it's bad if you have no idea where it's invested, how much you're paying for it, who's it with, how many pension pots have you got, all of those things. It can become a very inefficient mechanism for driving your longer term wealth. And one of the statistics in this Financial Lives survey was that I think it was under 12% of women read the literature, understand what their pension's invested in, know how much they're paying. Of the male participants, it was 34%, so still low.
Still really terrible.
It's still really terrible, and it goes back to partly it's the industry's
I think
fault.
that says more about the pension providers than it says about us.
Well, I think that's true.
They don't want to engage with us as consumers. They want to engage with the companies that we work for, and they've just got one customer. But as soon as we start popping up and saying, "Oh, can we have an ESG option?" or "Can I shift my investments around?" It's in their interest to make it hard. Otherwise, they're going to have to. I live in hope that with digital changes, more providers might feel inclined to get a bit more into the 21st century. But certainly, speaking to financial advisors, they've made an incredible turn on a sixpence during lockdown to talk to us, digitally. But and you may well have experience of this with Netwealth, they find that the biggest barrier is not being able to talk to customers, but being able to deal with providers and in specie transfers, moving pensions around from one place to another. The timescales for doing anything like that have, 100 days to move a pension. I was hearing about last week, which is just shocking.
Well, this is something we hear about a lot, and I mean the nice thing is we can help because we have client service teams who actually they know what questions to ask and how to get this thing speeded up. So I'm afraid I'm very cynical about the reason the industry isn't moving that quickly, because it's simply not in their interests. But it's in my interest and our interest to make that change. But I think it is one of the reasons why when we talk about in Financial Tribes somebody who has their head in the sand, it's made easier to have your head in the sand because the barriers to actually acting can be harder than they should.
And too much information. People are just feeling overwhelmed by the amount of things that they think they should be doing, and then it becomes easier to make no decision at all. You've got to really break these things down and say, okay, what are my biggest priorities here? And how can I turn that one big scary task into 10 or even 12 more manageable tasks? And maybe if you do have a partner, could you kind of split the load more equally between you?
Now, somebody actually has written and said, it's all very well, you're busy talking about people with partners, but what about a divorcee? And, I would say everything we're talking about is absolutely as relevant. It's just a bit harder if you're forced to think about it on your own, and if you would prefer not to. But, the other thing I would say is, get on top of your position. So we deal with a lot of divorcees, which I'm delighted by, actually. I don't know if it's partly having a female CEO, but I like the fact we can help people at times when they're maybe feeling their most vulnerable. But it does go back to that point that if we are to generalise, it is more likely that maybe women feel less comfortable with this divorce settlement that they have and with what to do with it. And at the same time, I would worry that they're in a vulnerable situation in terms of the number of people who would like to help them with it. So I think all of what we've discussed in terms of the characteristics that sit with people and their money, obviously it's the same whether married or not. But we recognise that in some cases, you're having to deal with these things on your own.
Well, two very small things on divorce before we move on. I do have great sympathy with the person watching. It's very, very hard. It's emotionally and financially draining. We do know, it's a fact, that often pension assets do not come into divorce settlements, sometimes because women are entirely unaware and their legal representatives, who should be asking these questions, don't ask the questions. So that's one thing to think of if you're in the process of being divorced. The second thing is, in the top 10 articles that FT Money has had online readers for this year, one of them in the top 10 is, help, I'm getting divorced and I think my husband is hiding his crypto assets from me, because crypto has created another kind of pension issue.
Yes.
So the pensions in divorce are one thing, but then if you've got these crypto assets that may or may not be being declared because it is so unregulated and yet so valuable, that is another source of anxiety from our readers. So there you go.
So you need to have someone on your side asking the right questions and really helping you sort of navigate.
One area which is an absolute font of advice, bizarrely, because you may not expect it, is Instagram. There are some absolutely brilliant accounts on Instagram from financial planners, qualified financial planners, who work with lawyers and run businesses that specialise in giving advice before divorce, during divorce, and after divorce. And again, financial planners rather than investment advisors. So, you need to know the difference in these types of advice. But, they put out an awful lot of free resources, free videos, but also have great comments from other people who are in exactly the same position as you. So to our divorced watcher, I would say, do have watchers, do have a look on Instagram, because often when you are feeling in a hole financially, knowing that there are lots of other people in your tribe who are in the same situation can be a really empowering feeling.
So we talked a bit about self-sufficient savers, which is the sort of dominant tribe. There's the people who with their head in the sand. I think another one which I'm really interested in is a group we've called the wealth skeptic. And I think of this partly because I have young adult children, and I know they have quite different views about wealth and if they were to have money, what they would do with it. And we've seen this quite a lot with clients. And it's a worry as a parent when you think about giving money, thinking about what will happen to that money if they have very different views. Now, a wealth skeptic is going to be somebody who might be quite well organised themselves, living on a relative shoestring. So they're practically quite good with money, but typically they have this conscience that makes them very unhappy with the idea of storing wealth. Because in my view, it's because they can't imagine being 50 or 60 and needing that money. They're thinking about, today I don't need it and therefore there's a better place for it. And actually we have had an experience with a family that we were working with where they gave a pretty substantial sum to each of their 4 children for homes, and 3 of them went and ended up buying
transacted,
the house. And the 4th gave it all to charity.
Oh.
And the parents were horrified. Now, I think that is a great example of lack of communication. It made them then think, goodness, what do we do about the rest of our planning now? Because we don't know how this individual child is behaving differently from the others. And so how do we think about now fairly transferring wealth, but in a way where we're not worrying that a big chunk of it may end up in a third party's hands? And I think one of the conversations that we've had with families in this situation is that for the young adult children that are these wealth skeptics, and it typically is more that generation in particular, they often don't have a sense for what the options are. So one of the things I mean by that is if you have a child who is minded to be philanthropic, which is fantastic, then, and they are going to feel uncomfortable with this notion of storing wealth, they need to understand why they may need to store some wealth for the future. And again, communication in the family to explain why they may need it. But to the extent there's excess, it is to think about things like, it's very easy now to set up a charitable trust and to put the money in and to help them understand how they could grow the money they would just have given away today, grow it, give away a certain amount every year to the charities of their choice, but keep the capital sum to grow and allow them to continue to give money away. So I think, again, this is very much down to how parents communicate to children and children to their parents, so that we have this level of transparency around how do people feel about whichever position they find themselves in. Yeah,
well, I mean, I think two things from that. Firstly, if you are going to give your money away, giving while still living, when you give that money away, your control over what your child does with the money ends. Now, I kind of feel a sneaking sense of admiration to the child who did give the money to charity. I mean, I'm sure that they did have a philanthropic intent and that they chose a charity that really meant something to them. But maybe it also meant a little bit to them to kind of stick two fingers up to their parents and say, I don't need your money. You don't need to give me this. I'm going to make my own way in the world. And the second thing is that giving money is one thing, but, giving the ability to manage that money well, and I'm not saying, sit them down and drum them through, some kind of like learn how to invest in the stock market online course, but, prepare them for the fact that money is going to come to them. Talk to them about what you do with your own money. Now, because I'm having my conversations with, my stepchildren rather than my biological children, I think I find it slightly easier because we're not blood relatives. We're slightly at one remove. We're in each other's lives because we want to be, not because we have to be. And again, I'm in a very privileged position that they do actually listen to the things I say. They don't do everything I say. I wouldn't expect them to do that, but I just want them to have the best shot at life. And I think that they very much get that from me. I'm not telling them what to do. I'm here to help them when they want to come to me, and equally. I try not to micromanage, and I think children whose parents are like really trying to micromanage their finances or being disapproving about the partner they might have picked, because that's another big problem within families. Give money to your child, and then later they go on to divorce, and the money is dispersed. Families giving money with conditions. It's quite a dangerous game. I think you just have to be of the view that once you've given the money. That's it, it's gone. And one thing we do, which is very popular, is a Young Investor Day. And it's interesting because this is for children, young adults, anywhere from sort of 18 to 28, that sort of range. And what's really interesting is we've had these young adults come in with completely different educational backgrounds. They're certainly not all mathematicians, and it's been really nice to see. They have a half a day, and the reason that their parents have wanted them to go there is this point about just start engaging with money, start understanding about, what the money can do for you. What does investing mean? What can you do yourselves? What might you have someone else do? What should you be looking out for? And so on. And I think, as you say, once you've decided to hand money over to your child, then you have to accept that they will do with it what they do. And there is that tension that we discussed earlier between, okay, does that mean you therefore feel less inclined to give them money because you're anxious about it? And does that revert back to, well, let's wait until I'm dead and then they can see what they get? We'll see what HMRC collect instead. Well, so that's exactly one of the things which we only have just sort of very lightly touched on, which is, of course, it is tax efficient to start giving your money away earlier to get the tax clock ticking and to get over the 7-year hurdle. So it's something which I think if there's a message we've been able to convey this evening, it's about the need for families to have this open communication, the need to try to confront perhaps some aspects around personal finance which are not traditionally areas of comfort for people, to find a way to make this a more common
common discussion to have, is a very English thing that I think we're all so sort of uptight about it. I mean, in America, for example, people are much more happy to talk about finances in a sort of more open manner.
They are. But it's not just a financial conversation. I think, coming back to what I said about, me and my partner talking about our goals and, what we wanted out of life, I think that really is the conversation to focus on rather than the numbers. So it's not saying, I need you to give me £20,000 because that's the only way I can get on the property ladder, mother, or I would like to give you this much money because that's what my accountant has told me is the most tax efficient thing.
Yes.
Those are not emotionally connected conversations. Listening to, what our children would like to do, where they would like to end up in the world. I mean, the pandemic has kind of snuffed out a lot of dreams and plans in some areas, like travelling, but then it's also opened a lot of doors. We've seen an awful lot of businesses being started up. We've seen people who've been dealt a blow in one area of their life to, have that as the impetus to spring back and, do something incredible and move on. So it's really grasping onto, where we want to get to, and then as the second element, how could money help be a part of that?
Yeah. So we're just at an hour. So I'm going to ask you for your, if there were two messages, for example, two sort of takeaways that you would suggest for the listeners this evening, what might they be?
I think my absolutely overriding message is that it's not just one conversation. There's a lot of anxiety often with talking about family members, whether it's the people who are older than us or the people who are younger than us. How do we approach these conversations? Just start. I would say it's probably better to be face to face, because emails can be misunderstood. But fortunately, now we're able to meet up again. That takes some of the pressure out of it. And secondly, just to reiterate, focus on the goals, focus on the good things.
Yes.
That money and having a more open and honest relationship about money in your family can bring for you, rather than on the on the hard numbers. What are the things that the pandemic has taught you about what you really enjoy about life and what you really value?
Yeah, well, that's very good advice. And I think what I would perhaps add, and because I completely agree with those points, is that there is the potential to ask for help outside the family. So, we love dealing with families, and we love it particularly with families who are communicating with each other. But going back to that point very early on that we were saying about personal finance still sometimes being difficult. So one thing is to have the conversation and to think about the goals, but then when you think about implementation, sometimes people sort of come up against a brick wall again, because it's sort of taking it that step further. It's actually execution, if you like, at that point.
Well, they need somebody to kind of hold their hand and
Yeah.
lead them through the enormous to-do list that's scaring them off.
That's right. And I think, in fact, one of the questions was, how do I go about finding a financial advisor? And I suppose, in a way, I'm the wrong person to ask given I run Netwealth, but in a way I'm the right person to ask because, I felt pretty strongly that there was a way that this could be done better, where people could have access to humans, but as we said at the outset, sort of helped by technology and allowing finance just to become more manageable. I have this saying in the company, which is I want people to get closer to their money. And I, rather than this question of being more and more distant and someone else doing it for you and you losing sight of what's going on. So I think a lot of the discussion this evening, and I hope that's what people have felt, is that this is about making finance simpler, more transparent, having more open conversations, dealing with some of those thorny issues, doing it more than once, making it something which is a sort of just a part of living. And therefore, I think at the same time, addressing potential issues will start to be easier to address because it'll be a more natural conversation to have within the family. But Claire, I must thank you so much for joining me this evening. You more than made up for the fact that there should have been two.
This is the problem. I'm good at talking about money, that's for sure. But thank you very much for having me. And Emma, if you're watching, I hope you're feeling better soon.
Yes, so we certainly hope that Emma feels better soon. And Thank you all for joining. We will answer any questions that we didn't get to separately, and we'll also send around the piece on financial tribes so that you can, for anyone interested, you can take a closer look at the different tribes and where you may see yourselves fitting in and your family members. But many thanks indeed for joining us this evening, and we look forward to being in touch.